Kaffee. Koffein ist die am weltweit meisten konsumierte pharmakologisch wirksame Substanz. Jeder trinkt Kaffee, es ist ein ganz normales Prozedere, es hat einen erheblichen Einfluss auf unsere Leistungsfähigkeit, auf unsere Produktivität, auf unseren Fokus. Ich habe ein Video entdeckt von Huberman, The Ugly Truth About Koffein. Das werden wir uns jetzt anschauen.
So I went to the doctor and I took some urine.
Nochmal ganz kurz. Koffein blockiert die Adenosinrezeptoren. Das heißt, unsere Wahrnehmung von Müdigkeit und Ermüdung wird verfälscht. Das ist die Quintessenz von Koffein.
Blood analysis, and they started talking to me about alcoholism. Now, I don't drink, but they were convinced I was an alcoholic because my liver enzymes were elevated. Then we got around to a discussion about caffeine. It turned out that I was drinking anywhere from 3 to 4 grams of caffeine a day. You can kill yourself drinking too much caffeine, but I prided myself on long work hours back then, and it was really bad. So what's caffeine doing? Caffeine is causing the liberation of adrenaline from your adrenals, these 2 little marble-sized glands above your kidneys. That tends to activate the so-called sympathetic nervous system, make you a little bit more prone to move, bring some alertness to your body. And then simultaneously, it's causing the release of norepinephrine and epinephrine from this little cluster of neurons called locus coeruleus. So the brain is being hosed with a little bit of epinephrine as we speak right now. In addition, it's triggering a dopamine increase, but not by triggering the release of dopamine directly. Caffeine increases the sensitivity of dopamine receptors. So whatever dopamine is floating around in your system and my system, the caffeine is amplifying that effect.
Dopamin ist so ein krasses Schlüsselhormon in unserem Körper. Das merkt man ja auch beim Eisbaden. Dort hat es ja auch einen signifikanten Einfluss darauf, wie du dich den ganzen Tag über fühlst, wenn du morgens ein Eisbad machst. Das ist wirklich ein Gamechanger.
Not necessarily by making it a longer effect, by making the intensity a little bit higher. The other thing that caffeine does, and this is perhaps the most important one, is that it effectively prevents the action of a molecule called adenosine. Adenosine is a molecule that builds up the longer that you are awake, and then when you sleep, adenosine gets pushed back down to a minimal level. Adenosine essentially is a readout of fatigue overall. So if we were to stay up for 2 days, adenosine levels would be very high. So in terms of a practical
Vielen wird das Wort Adenosin bekannt vorkommen, wahrscheinlich aus der Schule, ATP und ADP-Synthese. Dort habt ihr das wahrscheinlich schon mal gehört.
Tool. I do try and restrict my caffeine intake, or at least most of it, to the early part of the day. I'll stop drinking caffeine usually around 3 or 4 p.m. I don't drink any high amount of caffeine after 4 p.m. and generally not coffee. But when you wake up in the morning, depending on how well and how long you slept, your levels of adenosine might be zeroed out and you feel really alert, or you might have a small amount of adenosine hanging around. If you drink caffeine right away, what happens is caffeine essentially binds to the receptor that adenosine would normally occupy.
It's an antagonist.
It's an antagonist, but it's what we call a competitive agonist because it binds, so it's an agonist, but it outcompetes the adenosine, so the adenosine can't dock at those receptors. So that's great because you start to wake up. But then around 2 or 3 p.m., as that caffeine wears off, the adenosine that's still around binds to those receptors and you get the afternoon crash. So one way that you can avoid the afternoon crash, or at least offset quite a bit of it, is to wait 90 to 120 minutes after you wake up to ingest any caffeine. It is important.
Ganz wichtig, das Timing von Koffein. Viele Menschen nehmen direkt am Morgen, wenn sie aufgestanden sind, das erste, was sie zuführen, ist Kaffee, Koffein. Ist falsch, denn Cortisol wird ausgeschüttet, um Melatonin zu verdrängen und wach zu werden. Das geschieht sowieso. Deswegen, ich würde sogar sagen, 3 bis 4 Stunden warten. Ich trinke meinen ersten Kaffee tendenziell erst, wenn ich 4 Stunden wach bin. Das heißt, ich war mit den Hunden draußen, ich habe ein kleines Workout gemacht, ich habe geatmet und dann führe ich Koffein zu und man fühlt sich wesentlich besser. Denn das Erste, was der Körper am Morgen benötigt, sind die 3 Säulen. Bewegung, Licht und Wasser. Und das ist, was ich meinem Körper gebe und damit fahre ich super gut.
To hydrate early in the day too. Caffeine is very dehydrating. It causes for various reasons related to its effects on the kidneys, you start to excrete sodium and potassium and the electrolytes. And those, the action potential, the firing of neurons that we were talking about earlier, is mediated by the entry of sodium into the nerve cells and to some extent the exit of potassium. It's a coordinated dance there. You need electrolytes for your nerve cells to fire. So when you're dehydrated, you can't think as well. You can't function as well at the neuromuscular junction. So the first thing I do when I wake up is drink water. I mean, you should hydrate first thing in the morning. Obviously, you should use the bathroom too if you need to do that. But then push out that caffeine intake a little bit. And it's a little uncomfortable at first, and some people don't experience an afternoon crash, or people that are going back for more caffeine in the afternoon, they often find that they can drop or halve the amount of caffeine that they're drinking in the afternoon, which then has a nice cascade on the sleep system and the ability to fall asleep.
Often I hear when coffee comes up, people talk about adrenal fatigue and pineal calcification. I'm not sure.
Okay.
Are these legitimate sort of phenomenons, or have you looked into those?
Yeah. So adrenal burnout is a myth. I'm not saying that burnout is a myth, by the way. Adrenal burnout is not a real thing. The adrenals don't burn out. Your adrenals are immensely powerful. They were designed to take you through famine and horrible experiences and challenges that could go on 3 lifetimes. There is something called adrenal insufficiency syndrome, which is a legitimate syndrome where the adrenals don't produce enough adrenaline or enough cortisol, because the adrenals have a multi-layers, and cortisol is released from one compartment and cells in one compartment and adrenaline from the other. You can create a system of, wired and tired in your brain and body that comes from excessive caffeine intake. I think it makes sense to not overindulge in caffeine. And over the years, I'll tell you a story very briefly. In graduate school, I became jaundiced.
Wenn wir jetzt gerade von Koffein sprechen, ich nehme zum Beispiel Crank Focus zu mir, da sind 100 Milligramm Koffein und 100 Milligramm L-Theanin. Das ist die perfekte Symbiose, diese beiden Stoffe ergänzen sich sehr gut. Gerade im Bereich, wenn man geistig arbeitet, pusht es mich auch enorm, und ich einen guten Workflow haben will, mit dem Code T800 könnt ihr mindestens 10% sparen.
So I went to the doctor and I took some urine and blood analysis, and they started talking to me about alcoholism. Now, I don't drink. I used to have a drink or two now and again, but they were convinced I was an alcoholic because my liver enzymes were elevated. Then we got around to a discussion about caffeine. It turned out that I was drinking anywhere from 3 to 4 grams of caffeine a day. A typical cup of coffee is maybe 200, 500 milligrams. You can kill yourself drinking too much caffeine. And I wasn't on my way to death, but I was drinking far too much caffeine. But I prided myself on long work hours back then, and it was really bad, I think. And it was hard to taper that back. Now I drink usually a cup or two of coffee early in the day. Yerba mate is my preferred source of caffeine. Some days I don't drink any coffee. So you can really overdo it. I don't think you're going to burn out your adrenals. I think you're going to
Ja, also ich habe diese Tendenz auch. Ich habe lange gar keinen Kaffee getrunken, habe dann aber gemerkt, wie mich das pusht. Bin dann tendenziell jemand, der es auch gerne übertreibt und 3, 4 Tassen trinkt. Das war auf jeden Fall zu viel, weil ich war einfach nur zerstreut. Ich habe 4 Sachen gleichzeitig gemacht. Ich bin ja sowieso von der Tendenz eher jemand, der eher hyperaktiv ist und eine zu hohe Aktivität nicht nur im geistigen, sondern auch im physischen Bereich hat. Das heißt, ich laufe auf und ab, wenn ich Sachen tue, wenn ich telefoniere. Das hat es massiv gepusht, und mir hat es wirklich auch geholfen, auf mein Timing zu achten, wann ich Koffein zuführe, nicht direkt am Morgen und nicht zu spät am Abend, damit mein Körper auch die Ruhe bekommt, die er benötigt, um wieder zu regenerieren, wieder runterzukommen und nicht total zerstreut zu sein am Ende des Tages.
I think you're going to be stressed too often. You're just burning up energy. And we hear about fuel energy in the body, something you know far more about than I do, the utilization of fuel energy. But neurons and our nervous system have a sort of what I would call neural energy, the ability to focus, the ability to stay engaged. That's based on the dopamine and the noradrenaline system. And if you are chronically in a state of go, 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 and I should mention that dopamine and adrenaline, when they are enriched in our body and they're released in our brain, we tend to focus on that exteroception, things outside the boundaries of our skin. It's all about what we don't have going on now, or that we don't already possess, that we need and want.
So they're motivating us.
They are motivating us, but that being in pursuit is fatiguing over time. Whereas there are other neuromodulators and neurotransmitters like serotonin, oxytocin, things related to the anandamide system that are more about feeling content with what we already have or what's in the confines of our skin. The beautiful place we happen to live in, the people that we happen to have, social connection, they tend to be very soothing. And, for better or for worse, a lot of our success in life professionally and our ability to obtain those relationships and those things come from being in pursuit. But you have to think of this as a seesaw that you need to be able to run back and forth on. You can't just be in full pursuit of things all the time. You have to learn how to turn that off. And so I guess the point is that with excessive intake of caffeine or stimulants of any kind, nicotine, caffeine, you're going to run into a problem where you'll feel lousy without it. You'll start to feel a little bit more depressed, and for people who have an underlying...
Ja, aber am Ende des Tages ist es ja mit jeder Substanz so, die deine Leistungsfähigkeit verändert, dass du eine sowohl psychische als auch eventuell körperliche Abhängigkeit schaffst. Und das gilt es natürlich zu vermeiden. Deswegen, die Dosis macht das Gift am Ende des Tages. Ich denke, dass man auf jeden Fall das richtige Maß finden sollte. Wie viel Koffein führe ich zu? Wann bin ich produktiv? Es gilt natürlich auch immer eine Life-Work-Balance zu schaffen. Das heißt, wenn du deine 14, 15 Stunden nur noch mit Kaffee arbeiten kannst, dann dann musst du halt am Ende des Tages was ändern. Der Körper braucht einfach diese regenerativen Phasen, um einfach über einen längeren Zeitraum leistungsfähig zu bleiben. Das ist ganz wichtig. Und da gehört natürlich die richtige Dosis von Koffein auch dazu.
Issues with OCD or who have underlying anxiety, for people that tend to ruminate, for people that tend to have insomnia, it makes sense. You're just ingesting far too many stimulants.
Yeah, it's not going to be for everyone, at least not at a certain dose.
Right. You have to find the sweet spot. And I always say that when you haven't slept well is when you should drink less caffeine. When you've slept really well, you can get away with drinking more caffeine because you're more regulated. The autonomic nervous system is also like a seesaw. You have this, what we call sympathetic or alertness system, and then you have a parasympathetic nervous system. And they're controlled by different neurons and molecules in the body. But don't think about the seesaw as you. What's happening is you have the seesaw inside of you, and you're kind of running back and forth. Okay, it's like, get to the appointment and have the meeting, do the podcast. Okay, we're really lasered in. And then do you have the ability afterwards to adjust that seesaw back? When you're sleep deprived, the hinge on that seesaw becomes very loose. So it's sort of like, boom, you're just locked in. I got to go. And then you're exhausted. Boom. And so when you haven't slept well, you can probably get away with drinking a little bit of caffeine, but your whole system is dysregulated. When you've slept really well, you can probably drink more caffeine and feel more in control of your mind and body. So it's a little counterintuitive. Yeah, exactly.
Einfach wieder mal extrem geil, was Huberman hier für Aussagen getroffen hat und wie er das perfekt erklärt hat. Der Zusammenhang zwischen Schlaf, der Absorption von Koffein, der Leistungsfähigkeit, die dadurch hervorgeht und wann es einfach zu viel ist für den Körper. Also, wie gesagt, achtet darauf, wie viel Koffein führt ihr zu, wann führt ihr das Koffein zu und achtet vor allem darauf, dass ihr einen geregelten Biorhythmus habt. Der Schlafrhythmus ist das A und O für unsere regenerativen Prozesse im Körper. Wir werden uns diesbezüglich auch noch mehr anschauen und natürlich auch noch mehr Reaktionsvideos dazu machen. Mir mega gut gefallen, das Video. Auf jeden Fall wieder ein paar Fakten dabei, die ich so noch nicht wahrgenommen habe.